The Woman Who Wore Red at the Funeral. Welcome to Warm Pages. I'm your host, Edward, and I'm so glad you're joining us. Isn't it remarkable how these quiet mysteries connect us no matter where in the world we are? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next cozy mystery. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I read every single one. Now make yourself comfortable with a warm cup of tea or coffee, and let's begin. Chapter 1. The Scandalous Mourner. The morning of Harold Whitmore's funeral dawned grey and sombre as befitted the occasion. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her black gloves as she made her way along the familiar path to St Mary Mead Church, her keen blue eyes taking in the gathering crowd of mourners. The entire village, it seemed, had turned out to pay their respects to Mr Whitmore, who had been, by all accounts, a pillar of the community and a most respectable businessman. "Such a shock," murmured Mrs Bantry, falling into step beside Miss Marple. "Harold seemed so robust for his age. Heart attack, wasn't it?" "So Dr Haydock said," Miss Marple replied quietly, though something in her tone suggested she found the suddenness of Mr Whitmore's demise rather curious. She had observed enough of life's patterns to know that things were not always as they appeared on the surface. The church bell tolled solemnly as the mourners filed into the ancient stone building. Miss Marple took her usual seat in the third pew, positioning herself where she could observe the proceedings with her customary attention to detail. The widow, Mrs Margaret Whitmore, sat in the front pew, draped in deepest black, her face appropriately pale and drawn with grief. Beside her sat a young man whom Miss Marple recognised as James Whitmore, Harold's son from his first marriage. The service proceeded with proper solemnity. The Reverend Leonard Clement delivered a eulogy that painted Harold Whitmore as a devoted husband, loving father, and successful businessman who had contributed greatly to the welfare of St Mary Mead. Miss Marple found herself studying the faces of the congregation, noting the genuine sorrow on some faces and the more perfunctory expressions of duty on others. Mr Blackwood, Harold's business partner, sat rigidly in his pew, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. There was something nervous about his demeanour that caught Miss Marple's attention. Nearby she spotted Mr Pemberton, the family solicitor, who kept glancing at his pocket watch as though eager for the service to conclude. It was just as the congregation was preparing to follow the coffin to the graveside that the disruption occurred. The heavy oak doors of the church swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through the sacred space, and a figure appeared silhouetted against the grey morning light. A collective gasp arose from the assembled mourners as the newcomer stepped into the nave. She was a woman of perhaps 50, tall and striking, with dark hair swept elegantly beneath a wide-brimmed hat. But it was not her beauty that caused the sensation. It was her attire. In a sea of traditional black mourning dress, she wore a dress of brilliant crimson red, the colour of fresh blood or summer roses. The woman walked with measured steps down the centre aisle, her heels clicking against the stone floor in the profound silence that had fallen over the congregation. Miss Marple felt a familiar stirring of interest, the same feeling she experienced when she encountered one of those little puzzles that life occasionally presented. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice carrying clearly through the church as she approached the front pew where Margaret Whitmore sat. "I believe there has been some mistake." Margaret Whitmore looked up, her face a picture of confusion and growing alarm. "I beg your pardon?" The woman in red smiled, though there was nothing pleasant about the expression. "Allow me to introduce myself. I am Mrs Victoria Whitmore, Harold's true wife. I believe I should be sitting in the place of honour as chief mourner." The effect of these words was electric. A murmur of shock rippled through the congregation like a wave. Margaret Whitmore rose to her feet, her face now flushed with indignation. "How dare you!" she exclaimed. "How dare you come here and make such outrageous claims? Harold was my husband. We were married for 30 years. Victoria Whitmore's smile widened slightly. "Indeed. How interesting. Harold and I were married in 1952, which I believe predates your own union by some 3 years. That would make you, my dear, the interloper. The church erupted in whispers and gasps. Several people half rose from their seats, uncertain whether to intervene or simply watch this extraordinary drama unfold. Miss Marple remained seated, but her eyes were bright with interest as she observed every nuance of the scene. "This is preposterous," Margaret cried. "James, tell this woman she's mistaken." But James Whitmore appeared to be in a state of shock, his face pale and his mouth hanging slightly open. He seemed unable to form words. Mr. Blackwood had also risen, his nervous demeanour now transformed into something approaching panic. "Perhaps we should discuss this matter privately," he suggested, his voice strained. "There is nothing to discuss privately," Victoria declared, her voice rising. "Harold lived a double life, and I will not allow his death to erase 20 years of my marriage. I have every right to mourn my husband." The Reverend Clement, who had been standing frozen beside the altar, finally found his voice. "Ladies, please. This is a house of God, and we are here to pay our respects to the deceased. Perhaps this matter could be resolved elsewhere." "It will be resolved here and now," Victoria said firmly. She opened her red handbag and withdrew a folded document. "I have my marriage certificate dated May 15th, 1952. Harold Whitmore was my lawful husband, and I will not be denied my rightful place at his funeral." Margaret Whitmore's composure finally cracked completely. "Get her out!" she shrieked. "Get this mad woman out of here! She's disrupting my husband's funeral with her lies!" Two of the ushers moved forward uncertainly, but Victoria held up her hand. "I will leave," she said with dignity, "but only because I will not further disturb Harold's rest. However, let me say this clearly. Harold's secrets will not be buried with him. The truth has a way of surfacing, and I intend to see that justice is done." With that dramatic declaration, she turned and walked back down the aisle, her red dress a blazing beacon of defiance against the sea of black. The church doors closed behind her with a final resounding thud. For a moment the silence was complete. Then the whispers began in earnest, a buzzing undercurrent of speculation and shock that seemed to fill every corner of the ancient building. Miss Marple sat very still, her mind working rapidly. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that the most scandalous accusations often contained a grain of truth. The woman in red had been too confident, too prepared with her documentation to be dismissed as a simple madwoman. And the reactions of those who'd known Harold best, the nervous Mr. Blackwood, the confused Mr. Pemberton, the shocked James, suggested that this revelation had struck closer to home than anyone cared to admit. As the funeral procession finally made its way to the graveside, Miss Marple found herself wondering about the woman who had dared to wear red to a funeral. It was either the act of a grief-stricken woman desperate to claim her rightful place, or the calculated move of someone with a very different agenda entirely. Either way, Miss Marple was quite certain that this was not the end of the matter. In her experience, secrets had a way of demanding attention, and the bigger the secret, the more dramatic its eventual revelation was likely to be. The woman in red had thrown down a gauntlet that could not be ignored, and Miss Marple had the distinct feeling that Harold Whitmore's funeral was only the beginning of a much larger and more complex mystery. Chapter 2. The Widow's Unexpected Rival. The funeral tea at the Whitmore residence was a subdued affair, though the undercurrent of excitement generated by the morning's extraordinary scene was palpable. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Whitmore's housekeeper, and positioned herself in a corner of the drawing-room where she could observe the other guests without appearing to do so. Margaret Whitmore moved through her guests with the mechanical precision of someone in shock. Her earlier outburst at the church had been replaced by a brittle composure that seemed ready to shatter at the slightest provocation. She accepted condolences with gracious nods, but Miss Marple noticed that her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup. "Dreadful business," murmured Colonel Melchett, approaching Miss Marple with his own cup and saucer. "That woman in red, whoever she was, caused quite a stir. Poor Margaret looks absolutely shattered." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed quietly, though one must wonder what would possess someone to make such a public scene, unless they believed their claim had some foundation. The Colonel harumphed disapprovingly. Nonsense. Clearly the woman was unhinged. Harold Whitmore was as respectable as they come. Been married to Margaret for decades. Everyone knows that. Miss Marple made a non-committal sound and continued to observe. James Whitmore stood by the window, staring out at the garden with an expression of profound bewilderment. Mr. Blackwood hovered near the refreshment table, though he seemed to have little appetite for the sandwiches and cakes. Mr. Pemberton, the solicitor, was engaged in what appeared to be an urgent whispered conversation with Margaret near the mantelpiece. It was perhaps an hour after the guests had begun to disperse that Margaret Whitmore approached Miss Marple directly. The younger woman's composure was clearly hanging by a thread. "Miss Marple," she said in a low voice, "might I have a word with you privately? I find myself in need of advice from someone of your wisdom and experience." Miss Marple set down her teacup with gentle precision. "Of course, my dear. Perhaps we might step into the morning room." Once they were alone, Margaret's carefully maintained facade crumbled. She sank into an armchair and buried her face in her hands. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "That terrible woman. I've never seen her before in my life. Never heard Harold mention anyone named Victoria. How could she make such claims?" Miss Marple settled herself in the opposite chair, her manner both gentle and alert. "You say you've never heard of her at all?" "Never!" Margaret looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but fierce. "Harold and I were married in 1955, right here in St. Mary Mead. We had a beautiful ceremony. Everyone in the village attended. Look." She rose and moved to a small writing desk from which she withdrew a leather document folder. Her hands shook slightly as she extracted an official-looking paper. "Our marriage certificate," she said, holding it out to Miss Marple. "June 18th, 1955, St. Mary Mead Parish Church. Harold was a widower then. His first wife had died in 1951. We met at a church social, and he courted me properly for 2 years before proposing. How could that woman claim to have married him in 1952? Miss Marple examined the certificate carefully, noting the official seals and signatures. It appeared genuine in every respect. Had Harold ever mentioned travelling for business during your courtship period? Margaret looked puzzled by the question. Well, yes, of course. He had business interests that required him to travel occasionally, but that's perfectly normal for a man in his position. And after your marriage, did he continue to travel? Certainly. Harold was very dedicated to his work. He would often spend several days each month attending to business matters in neighbouring towns. I admired his industry, though I sometimes wished he could spend more time at home. Miss Marple handed back the marriage certificate, her expression thoughtful. How long had these business trips been a regular occurrence? Oh, for years. Even before we married, he would sometimes disappear for a few days at a time. He explained that his business interests were quite varied and required personal attention. Margaret's voice took on a defensive tone. I trusted my husband completely, Miss Marple. Are you suggesting— I'm not suggesting anything, my dear, Miss Marple said gently. I'm simply trying to understand the situation. This woman who appeared today seemed remarkably confident in her claims. That suggests either complete delusion or what? Or some basis, in fact, however twisted it might be. Margaret sank back into her chair, looking suddenly older than her years. You don't believe her, do you? You can't possibly think Harold was capable of such deception. Before Miss Marple could respond, there was a soft knock at the morning room door. Margaret called for the visitor to enter, and James Whitmore stepped inside, his face still bearing the expression of shock that had characterized it since the morning's events. Mother, he said quietly, there's someone at the front door asking to see you. It's that woman from the church. Margaret's face went white. I won't see her. I won't have that creature in my house. She said she has something important to show you, James continued reluctantly. She's asked Miss Marple to be present as well, as an impartial witness. Miss Marple rose from her chair with quiet authority. Perhaps it would be best to hear what she has to say. If her claims are false, they can surely be disproven. If there's any truth to them, it's better to know now than to remain in ignorance. Margaret looked as though she might refuse, but something in Miss Marple's calm manner seemed to steady her. "Very well," she said finally. "But I want you there, Miss Marple. And James, you stay as well." Victoria Whitmore had changed from her dramatic red dress into a more subdued navy blue suit, though she still managed to look striking. She entered the morning room with the same confident bearing she had displayed at the church, but Miss Marple detected something else in her manner now, a deep, genuine grief that had been masked by her earlier defiance. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, addressing Margaret directly, "I apologise for the scene at the church. It was not my intention to disrupt Harold's funeral, but I felt I had no choice." "You had no right to be there at all," Margaret replied stiffly. Victoria reached into her handbag and withdrew a folded document, much as she had done at the church. "I think you should see this." She handed the paper to Miss Marple, who unfolded it carefully. It was indeed a marriage certificate bearing all the official seals and signatures that would mark it as genuine. The date was May 15th, 1952. The groom was listed as Harold Arthur Whitmore, and the bride as Victoria Rose Pembroke. "The church was St. Michael's in Little Wickham," Victoria said quietly. "A small ceremony. Harold said he preferred intimate occasions to grand displays." Miss Marple examined the document with the same careful attention she had given Margaret's certificate. The paper showed appropriate age, the signatures appeared consistent, and the official seals looked authentic. "Little Wickham is about 20 miles from here," James said slowly. "Father did conduct business there regularly." Victoria nodded. "We lived there as husband and wife for 20 years. Harold would tell you he was travelling on business, but those business trips were visits to his home with me." The silence that followed this statement was profound. Finally Margaret found her voice. "This is impossible," she whispered. "Harold couldn't have... He wouldn't have..." "I know how difficult this must be for you," Victoria said, and for the first time her voice held genuine compassion. "I had no idea about you until after Harold's death. He managed to keep our two lives completely separate." Miss Marple looked up from the marriage certificate. "Mrs. Whitmore, Mrs. Victoria Whitmore, you say you only learned of this other marriage after your husband's death?" "Harold collapsed at our home in Little Wickham last Tuesday evening. The doctor there said it was his heart. I was devastated, naturally, but I assumed I would be informed about funeral arrangements as his widow. Instead, I read about the service in the newspaper and saw that someone else was listed as the surviving spouse." "But surely there were legal matters to resolve," Miss Marple pressed gently. "Insurance policies, the will..." Victoria's composure wavered slightly. "That's where it becomes complicated. Harold always handled such matters himself. He said it was better for me not to worry about business affairs. I trusted him completely." Miss Marple folded the certificate carefully and handed it back. Both documents appeared genuine. Both women seemed sincere in their claims, and both had intimate knowledge of Harold Whitmore's character and habits. The implications were staggering. If both marriages were legitimate, then Harold Whitmore had successfully maintained two completely separate lives for over 20 years, lying consistently to two women who believed themselves to be his lawful wives. It was, Miss Marple reflected, either an extraordinary case of systematic deception or an equally extraordinary coincidence of false claims. And in her long experience she'd learned to be deeply suspicious of coincidences. "I think," she said quietly, "that this matter requires the attention of the authorities. Inspector Slack should be informed immediately." Both women looked at her with expressions of alarm, but Miss Marple's mind was already working ahead to the complications that must inevitably follow. If Harold Whitmore had indeed been a bigamist, the legal ramifications would be enormous, affecting inheritance, insurance, and the validity of all his business dealings. More troubling still was the question of why a man would choose to live such a complicated double life, and what other secrets might be hidden beneath the respectable facade he had maintained for so many years. Chapter 3 Whispers in Black and White. By the following morning, the news of Harold Whitmore's alleged bigamy had spread through St. Mary Mead like wildfire. Miss Marple, making her customary early morning trip to the post office, found herself the recipient of no fewer than 3 separate accounts of the previous day's extraordinary events, each more embellished than the last. "Such goings-on," declared Mrs. Price, the postmistress, leaning conspiratorially across the counter. "Mrs. Bantry stopped by not 10 minutes ago, and she says that woman in red has taken rooms at the 3 Crowns. Bold as brass she is, staying right here in the village as though she has every right." Miss Marple accepted her letters with a thoughtful expression. "I imagine Inspector Slack will want to investigate the matter thoroughly." "Oh, he's been round already," Mrs. Price continued eagerly. "Spoke to both women he did and came away looking like he'd seen a ghost. Mrs. Clement says he was muttering something about impossible situations when he stopped by the vicarage." The bell above the door chimed as Mrs. Dolly Bantry entered, her face flushed with excitement and the brisk morning air. "Jane!" she exclaimed. "Thank goodness you're here! Have you heard the latest? That Victoria woman has been asking questions all around the village about Harold's habits, his comings and goings, even about his favourite foods and hobbies." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "And what has she discovered?" "That's just it. She seems to know things about Harold that only a wife would know. Mrs. Jameson mentioned that Harold always took his tea with exactly 2 lumps of sugar and a slice of lemon, never milk." The Victoria woman nodded as though it was perfectly obvious. How would she know such a thing unless... Mrs. Bantry left the sentence hanging, but the implication was clear. Miss Marple made her way home with much to ponder. The morning's gossip had revealed something significant. Victoria Whitmore's knowledge of Harold's personal habits appeared to be genuine and detailed, supporting her claim of an intimate relationship. She had barely settled in her garden with her knitting when Inspector Slack arrived, looking harried and thoroughly out of sorts. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "I don't suppose you have any insights into this Whitmore business? Because I'm telling you now, it's the most confounding case I've ever encountered." Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded the inspector with interest. "Have you been able to verify the authenticity of the marriage certificates?" "That's just it. Both appear to be genuine. I've had them examined by experts, and there's no evidence of forgery. Harold Arthur Whitmore married Margaret Susan Fletcher at St. Mary Mead on June 18th, 1955, and the same Harold Arthur Whitmore married Victoria Rose Pembroke at St. Michael's in Little Wickham on May 15th, 1952. Inspector Slack slumped into the garden chair Miss Marple indicated, looking thoroughly defeated. "But surely you've investigated Harold's background," Miss Marple prompted gently. "That's where it gets interesting," Slack replied, pulling out his notebook. "Harold Whitmore's official employment records show several gaps, periods of months where there's no record of his activities or whereabouts. These gaps correspond exactly with the time frame when he would have been establishing himself in Little Wickham." Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, her fingers working automatically while her mind focused on the inspector's words. "And his financial situation? Here's another peculiar thing. In 1952, the same year he allegedly married Victoria, Harold inherited a substantial sum from a great-uncle in Yorkshire. The inheritance was large enough to allow him to purchase property in both locations and maintain 2 separate households." "How convenient," Miss Marple murmured. "And I suppose this inheritance provided him with the resources to travel frequently between his 2 lives." "Exactly. He purchased the house in Little Wickham in late 1952, just months after his marriage to Victoria. The property records show he lived there under the name Harold Williams, though all the legal documents were properly filed under his real name." Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. "Harold Williams? An interesting choice, similar enough to his real name to avoid confusion, different enough to maintain separation. And his business partner, Mr. Blackwood, what does he say about these frequent absences?" Inspector Slack's expression grew troubled. "That's where things become even more suspicious. Blackwood admits he knew about Harold's regular trips to Little Wickham, but he claims they were legitimate business ventures. Says Harold was investigating opportunities to expand their operations into neighbouring markets." "But you don't believe him?" "Blackwood is nervous as a cat, Miss Marple. When I pressed him about the specific nature of these business dealings, he became evasive. I get the distinct impression he knew more about Harold's double life than he's admitting." Miss Marple set down her knitting and fixed the inspector with her keen blue gaze. "Inspector, have you considered that this situation might be even more complex than it appears? A man who successfully maintains two separate identities for 20 years is not merely unfaithful, he's extraordinarily calculating and methodical." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that a man capable of such systematic deception might have had additional secrets. Have you thoroughly investigated his business affairs, his financial arrangements, the circumstances of his death?" Inspector Slack looked uncomfortable. "Dr. Haydock certified the death as heart failure. There was no reason to suspect anything unusual." "Perhaps not then," Miss Marple said quietly. "But circumstances have changed, haven't they? When a man lives a double life, one must wonder what else he might have been hiding." Before the inspector could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of James Whitmore, who appeared at the garden gate looking deeply troubled. "Miss Marple, Inspector," he said, approaching with obvious reluctance. "I'm afraid I have something to tell you, something I should have mentioned yesterday, but I was too shocked to think clearly." Inspector Slack straightened in his chair. "What is it, Mr. Whitmore?" James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that reminded Miss Marple strongly of his late father. "About 6 months ago, I found some papers in Father's study. Letters, actually. They were signed your loving wife Victoria, and they reference shared memories and experiences that spanned many years. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Why didn't you confront your father about these letters?" Miss Marple asked gently. I couldn't bring myself to do it. Father seemed so content with Mother, and I told myself the letters might be from some distant relative or family friend. I didn't want to believe. He trailed off, his distress evident. "Where are these letters now?" Inspector Slack demanded. "That's the strange thing. When I went to retrieve them after Father's death, they were gone. Someone had cleaned out his entire study, removed all his personal papers. Mother said she had asked Mr. Pemberton to handle Father's private affairs, but when I asked him about it, he seemed confused and said he hadn't touched anything in the study." Miss Marple felt that familiar stirring of interest that indicated a mystery was deepening rather than resolving itself. Someone took considerable risk to remove those letters. The question is whether they were taken to protect Harold's reputation posthumously, or to prevent them from supporting Victoria's claim. Inspector Slack was making rapid notes. "Mr. Whitmore, can you remember anything specific about the contents of these letters? Dates, locations, any details that might help verify Mrs. Victoria Whitmore's story? They mentioned Little Wickham specifically, and there were references to a house with a blue door and a garden full of roses. Victoria, that is, the woman who came to the funeral, mentioned that their home in Little Wickham has a distinctive blue front door. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a picture, though Miss Marple suspected it was still far from complete. Harold Whitmore had indeed lived a double life, maintaining 2 households and 2 wives with remarkable success for over 2 decades. But the systematic removal of evidence suggested that someone was now working very hard to control which version of the truth would survive. As James Whitmore took his leave and Inspector Slack departed to continue his investigation, Miss Marple remained in her garden, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The whispers spreading through St. Mary Mead were dividing the village into 2 camps, those who supported Margaret's claim to legitimacy and those who were intrigued by Victoria's bold assertions. But Miss Marple suspected that the truth, when it finally emerged, would prove more complex and more dangerous than anyone yet realised. In her long experience, secrets as elaborate as Harold Whitmore's were rarely maintained without cost, and that cost was often paid by those who threatened to expose the deception. The woman who had dared to wear red to a funeral had set events in motion that could not now be stopped, and Miss Marple had the uneasy feeling that the consequences would prove far more serious than a simple case of bigamy. Chapter 4. The Love Letters in the Coffin. It was Mrs. Clement who brought Miss Marple the most intriguing piece of information yet discovered. The vicar's wife arrived at Old Pasture just as Miss Marple was finishing her afternoon tea, her usually serene countenance troubled by obvious distress. "Jane, I hardly know how to begin," she said, accepting the cup of tea Miss Marple offered. "Something most peculiar has come to light, and I feel it my duty to share it with someone of discretion." Miss Marple settled back in her chair, recognising the signs of a revelation about to unfold. "Please, my dear, tell me what's troubling you." "It concerns Mr. Fellows, the funeral director," Mrs. Clement began hesitantly. "He came to see Leonard this morning in a state of considerable agitation. It seems there was an incident during the viewing period before Harold's funeral that he felt compelled to report." "An incident?" Mrs. Clement lowered her voice, though they were quite alone. "Someone attempted to place a bundle of letters in Harold's coffin. Mr. Fellows discovered them during his final preparations and removed them, thinking it inappropriate. But now, in light of recent revelations, he's wondering if he should have acted differently." Miss Marple's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "How very interesting. Did Mr. Fellows see who placed the letters there?" "He didn't witness the actual placement, but he has his suspicions. The viewing was restricted to family members, and he recalls that Margaret Whitmore's family had specifically requested that no unauthorised persons be permitted near the coffin. But someone managed to access it nonetheless. It would appear so. Mr. Fellows found the letters tucked beneath the satin lining near Harold's hands. They were tied with a red ribbon. Red Jane, just like that woman's dress." Miss Marple set down her cup with deliberate care. "And what became of these letters?" "That's just it. Mr. Fellows still has them. He's been agonising over what to do. He feels they should be returned to their rightful owner, but he doesn't know whether that would be Margaret or Victoria." "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that Inspector Slack should examine these letters before any decisions are made about their disposition." Mrs. Clement nodded gratefully. "That's precisely what Leonard advised. Mr. Fellows is willing to turn them over to the authorities, but he wanted the vicar's guidance first." Within the hour, Inspector Slack had retrieved the letters from the funeral director and brought them to Miss Marple for examination. They sat in her drawing room as he carefully untied the red ribbon that bound the small bundle. 23 letters in total, he announced, spreading them across Miss Marple's polished mahogany table. "All addressed to my dearest Victoria, and signed your devoted husband Harold." Miss Marple examined the topmost letter, noting the quality of the paper and the distinctive handwriting. The earliest is dated 1954, 2 years after Harold's alleged marriage to Victoria, and 1 year before his marriage to Margaret. Inspector Slack picked up another letter from the middle of the stack. "This one's from 1965. Listen to this. My darling, I know how difficult our situation has become, with my obligations in St. Mary Mead growing more complex each year. But please never doubt that you are my true companion, my heart's dearest treasure." "Obligations in St. Mary Mead," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "A curious way to refer to one's wife and family." The inspector continued reading. "Here's something from 1972. I have been giving serious thought to our discussion about resolving our circumstances permanently. The time may be approaching when I can no longer maintain this double existence. I grow weary of the deception, though I cannot bear the thought of losing either of the lives I have built." Miss Marple examined several more letters, noting the progression of Harold's emotional state over the decades. The early letters were passionate and optimistic, filled with promises of a future when their love could be openly acknowledged. The later correspondence revealed a man increasingly burdened by the weight of his duplicity. "Inspector," she said finally, "these letters paint a picture of genuine affection spanning 20 years. This was not a casual affair or a momentary lapse in judgment. Harold Whitmore was deeply attached to both women." "But look at this one," Slack said, holding up a letter dated just 6 months before Harold's death. He writes, "Victoria, my beloved, I have finally reached a decision. I cannot continue to live this divided existence. Within the year, I will have resolved our situation once and for all. Justice will be done, though it will cause pain to many. I pray you will forgive the years of uncertainty I have imposed upon you. The implications of this final letter were staggering. Harold had apparently been planning to end his bigamous situation by choosing between his two wives, but death had intervened before he could act. "The question," Miss Marple said slowly, "is whether Victoria knew of Harold's intention to regularise their situation. If she did, it would certainly explain her determination to claim her rightful place at his funeral." Inspector Slack was examining the red ribbon that had bound the letters. "This ribbon matches the trim on the dress Victoria wore to the funeral. She must have been the one who tried to place these in the coffin." "A symbolic gesture," Miss Marple observed. "She wanted Harold to take the proof of their love with him to the grave. When that was prevented, she chose to make her claim publicly instead." The inspector gathered the letters carefully. "I'll need to question Victoria about these. If she was attempting to place evidence in the coffin, it suggests she knew her claim would be disputed." After Inspector Slack departed, Miss Marple remained in her drawing room, pondering the implications of the love letters. They provided compelling evidence that Harold's relationship with Victoria had been genuine and enduring, but they also raised troubling questions about his state of mind in the months before his death. A man who had successfully maintained two separate lives for decades would not lightly abandon such an arrangement. What had driven Harold to contemplate ending his double existence? Was it simply the burden of deception growing too heavy, or had some external pressure forced his hand? Miss Marple recalled James Whitmore's mention of letters that had mysteriously disappeared from Harold's study. She wondered if those missing documents had contained Harold's plans for resolving his bigamous situation, and whether their removal had been designed to prevent anyone from learning which wife he had intended to choose. The love letters in the coffin told a story of genuine emotion and eventual resolution, but they also suggested that Harold's death might have been more convenient for some parties than others. A man preparing to make a choice between two wives would inevitably disappoint and potentially impoverish one of them. As evening shadows lengthened across her garden, Miss Marple found herself wondering whether Harold Whitmore's heart attack had been as natural as it had initially appeared. The timing was remarkably coincidental, occurring just as he was preparing to resolve a situation that had remained stable for over 20 years. In her long experience with human nature, Miss Marple had learned that when people stood to lose everything they held dear, they sometimes took desperate measures to protect their interests. The woman who had worn red to Harold's funeral had made her claim openly and dramatically, but someone else might have chosen a more subtle and permanent solution to the problem of Harold's divided loyalties. The love letters revealed the depth of Harold's emotional entanglement, but they also illuminated the high stakes involved in his final decision. Someone had worked very hard to remove evidence from Harold's study, and that same someone might have been equally determined to prevent Harold from making a choice that would destroy their carefully constructed life. Miss Marple made a mental note to suggest that Inspector Slack take a much closer look at the circumstances surrounding Harold Whitmore's death. The love letters had answered some questions about the bigamy, but they had raised far more serious concerns about whether Harold had lived long enough to resolve his divided existence of his own free will. Chapter 5. A Marriage Built on Lies. The news reached Miss Marple early on Thursday morning through the breathless arrival of Mrs. Bantry, who had clearly run the entire distance from the village centre. "Jane!" she gasped, clutching the garden gate for support. "Something terrible has happened. That Victoria woman, she's been found dead in her room at the Three Crowns." Miss Marple set down her watering can immediately, her expression growing grave. "Dead? How?" "Dr. Haydock is there now. But Mrs. Baker, she's the landlady at the Three Crowns, she says the poor woman was found this morning when she didn't come down for breakfast. Looked peaceful enough, lying in her bed, but—" Mrs. Bantry paused dramatically. "Dr. Haydock says he detected a strange smell in the room, something bitter, like almonds." Miss Marple felt a familiar chill of foreboding. Bitter almonds. That would suggest— "Poison," Mrs. Bantry finished in a whisper. "Though who would want to poison that poor woman? And why?" Within the hour, Inspector Slack arrived at Old Pasture, his usual harried expression replaced by something approaching grim determination. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, I'm afraid this Whitmore business has taken a very dark turn indeed. Victoria Whitmore is dead, and Dr. Haydock is certain it's cyanide poisoning." Miss Marple invited the inspector inside, her mind already working through the implications. When did this occur? Sometime during the night, according to the doctor's preliminary examination. She was discovered this morning when she failed to appear for breakfast. The landlady had been bringing her meals to her room since she arrived. Victoria had complained of feeling unwell since the funeral. "And you found evidence of poison?" Inspector Slack nodded grimly. "Traces of almond extract in a glass of water by her bedside. But here's the peculiar thing. Dr. Haydock says the amount of cyanide wasn't sufficient to kill her immediately. She would have had time to call for help, to make some noise, yet no one heard anything." Miss Marple settled into her favourite chair, her fingers automatically reaching for her knitting. "That suggests either that she was unconscious when the poison was administered, or that she took it willingly, believing it to be something else." "There's more," the inspector continued. "We found a collection of threatening letters in Victoria's room. Someone had been warning her to stop making false claims and to leave the dead in peace. The letters are unsigned, but they're written on expensive paper with what appears to be a fountain pen." "How many letters?" 5 in total, spanning the 3 days since Harold's funeral. Someone was very determined to discourage Victoria from pursuing her claim. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. "Inspector, what have you discovered about Harold's estate? Surely the financial implications of this bigamy question are significant." Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. "That's where things become very interesting indeed. Harold's estate is worth considerably more than anyone realised, including substantial property holdings in both St Mary Mead and Little Wickham, as well as several life insurance policies." "Life insurance policies?" 3 separate policies, Miss Marple, totalling nearly £50,000. What's particularly significant is that both Margaret and Victoria are named as beneficiaries on different policies. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. Harold was certainly thorough in his arrangements, but I imagine the insurance companies will not pay out while there's a question about the legitimacy of the marriages. "Exactly. And here's another complication. One of the policies contains a clause that doubles the payout if Harold's death is ruled accidental, but only if there's one legitimate widow to receive the benefit." The implications were staggering. If Victoria's claim to be Harold's lawful wife could be eliminated, Margaret would stand to inherit not only the entire estate, but also the full insurance benefits. It was a motive for murder that could hardly be ignored. "Inspector," Miss Marple said carefully, "have you considered that Victoria's death might not be the end of this matter? If someone is willing to commit murder to resolve the question of Harold's bigamy, they might not stop with eliminating one claimant." Before Inspector Slack could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of James Whitmore, who appeared at the drawing-room door looking pale and deeply shaken. "Inspector, Miss Marple," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've just come from Mr. Pemberton's office. There's something you need to know about Father's will." Inspector Slack gestured for James to take a seat. "What about the will, Mr. Whitmore?" "Mr. Pemberton has been going through Father's papers, trying to sort out the legal complications. He's discovered that Father made a new will just 2 months before his death. A will that acknowledges both marriages and attempts to divide the estate between both families." The silence that followed this revelation was profound. "Where is this will now?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "That's just it. Mr. Pemberton can't find the original. He has only a draft copy in his files, but the final signed version has disappeared. Without the original, the previous will stand, which leaves everything to Mother as Father's sole surviving spouse." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Slack. Someone had been systematically removing evidence that would support Victoria's claim. First the letters from Harold's study, now the revised will that would have legitimised both marriages. "James," she said gently, "does your mother know about this missing will?" The young man's face flushed with obvious discomfort. I told her this morning. She seemed as surprised as anyone, but..." He hesitated, clearly struggling with some painful suspicion. "But what?" Inspector Slack prompted. She asked very specific questions about what the will contained, about how much Victoria would have inherited. It was almost as though she wanted to know exactly what she stood to lose if the will were found. Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a disturbing picture. Victoria's death had eliminated the most credible witness to Harold's bigamy, and the missing will had removed the legal document that would have validated her claim. If James were to meet with an accident, there would be no one left who could testify to Harold's double life. "Inspector," she said urgently, "I think James may be in considerable danger. If someone is eliminating evidence and witnesses, he represents a significant threat to their plans." Inspector Slack was already reaching for his hat. "Mr. Whitmore, I think it would be best if you remained in protective custody until we can sort this matter out. Someone has already committed murder once, and I don't intend to give them another opportunity." As the two men prepared to leave, Miss Marple called out to the inspector, "One more thing. I think you should examine Harold's death much more carefully. The timing of his heart attack, just as he was preparing to resolve his bigamous situation, strikes me as remarkably convenient for someone who stood to lose everything." Inspector Slack nodded grimly. "I've already asked Dr. Haydock to review his findings. If Harold was murdered as well, we're dealing with someone who's been planning this for months." After they departed, Miss Marple remained in her drawing room, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The pattern was becoming clear, though the identity of the killer remained hidden. Someone had discovered Harold's intention to legitimize his bigamous marriages and had taken steps to prevent that resolution. Harold's death had been the first move, eliminating the man who could choose between his wives. Victoria's murder had removed the most credible claimant to Harold's estate, and now James, the only remaining witness to his father's double life, was in mortal danger. The woman who had worn red to Harold's funeral had been silenced, but her dramatic gesture had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately expose a killer far more calculating and ruthless than anyone had imagined. Miss Marple was quite certain that before this matter was resolved, more lives would be at risk, and the truth about Harold Whitmore's marriage built on lies would prove more deadly than anyone could have anticipated. Chapter 6, The Red Dress Revelation. Miss Marple's suggestion that Victoria's red dress might hold additional clues proved more prescient than even she had anticipated. Inspector Slack arrived at Old Pasture the following afternoon, with a peculiar expression of triumph mixed with bewilderment. "Miss Marple," he announced, settling into the chair she indicated, "you were quite right about examining that dress more carefully. What we found sewn into the lining defies all reasonable explanation." Miss Marple set aside her correspondence and gave the inspector her full attention. Hidden compartments? Precisely. Victoria Whitmore had created a series of concealed pockets throughout the dress, so expertly done that they were nearly invisible even upon close examination. Inside these pockets we discovered photographs, legal documents, and most significantly, a small brass key. The inspector withdrew an envelope from his briefcase and spread its contents across Miss Marple's tea table. The photograph showed Harold and Victoria in various domestic settings, gardening together, celebrating what appeared to be anniversaries, sharing quiet moments that spoke of genuine companionship spanning many years. These photographs date back to 1953, Inspector Slack continued, and continue right up until last month. They provide compelling evidence that Victoria's relationship with Harold was both authentic and enduring. Miss Marple examined the photographs with her characteristic attention to detail. The settings are clearly the little Wickham house you mentioned. There's the distinctive blue door James described. But what of the key? That led us to the most significant discovery yet. The key opens a safety deposit box at Barclays Bank in Little Wickham, registered under Harold's alternative identity of Henry Williams. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose with interest. And what did this safety deposit box contain? Inspector Slack's expression grew grave. Harold's real will, Miss Marple, the original document that Mr. Pemberton had been unable to locate. It acknowledges both marriages explicitly and divides the estate between both families with specific provisions for Victoria's financial security. How very thorough of Harold, But there was more, I presume? Indeed. Also in the box was a lengthy confession letter written in Harold's hand and dated just 1 week before his death. In it, he admits to living a double life for over 20 years and expresses his intention to resolve the situation by making both marriages legal through some form of formal arrangement. Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. A confession letter suggests Harold was preparing for some dramatic revelation. Did he indicate how he planned to accomplish this legal resolution? He wrote that he had consulted with solicitors about the possibility of obtaining a special license or parliamentary divorce that would allow him to legitimise both relationships. Apparently, there were precedents in cases involving military service abroad or other exceptional circumstances. The implications were staggering. Harold had not been planning to choose between his wives, but rather to find a legal mechanism that would validate both marriages. It was an extraordinary solution to an impossible situation. "Inspector," Miss Marple said slowly, "this confession letter changes everything. If Harold was planning to legitimise both marriages, then neither woman stood to lose her position or inheritance. What motive would anyone have for preventing such an arrangement?" Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. "That's where the investigation has taken an unexpected turn. According to the confession, Harold had informed his business partner Mr. Blackwood of his intentions. Blackwood was apparently horrified by the potential scandal and had threatened to dissolve their partnership if Harold proceeded with his plan." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, "and their business partnership was presumably quite valuable." "Extremely so. Harold's confession reveals that their joint ventures were worth considerably more than anyone realised, including several properties and investments that would be jeopardised by any public scandal surrounding Harold's personal life." Miss Marple picked up one of the photographs, studying Harold's face for clues to his state of mind. A man who keeps such detailed records and plans so carefully doesn't usually die of a sudden heart attack just as his plans are coming to fruition. Dr. Haydock has been re-examining Harold's death in light of recent events. While he can't definitively prove poisoning after this length of time, he's found several inconsistencies in his original assessment. What sort of inconsistency? Inspector Slack referred to his notes. Harold's symptoms, as described by Victoria, were more consistent with gradual poisoning than sudden cardiac failure. She mentioned that he had been feeling unwell for several weeks before his death, complaining of fatigue and digestive problems. Miss Marple set down the photograph with a thoughtful expression. Someone was slowly poisoning Harold to prevent him from legitimising his marriages. But who had access to both households? That's what makes this case so complex. Harold's business required him to travel regularly, and he frequently dined with associates in both towns. Mr. Blackwood, for instance, often met with Harold for business meals. And Victoria's death? Have you determined how the cyanide was administered? Inspector Slack's expression darkened. The poison was in a bottle of sleeping tablets that Victoria had been taking since Harold's death. Someone had replaced the medication with tablets containing cyanide. She would have taken her usual dose, expecting relief from her grief-induced insomnia. Miss Marple felt a chill of recognition. The same methodical approach used with Harold. Gradual poisoning disguised as natural causes or medical treatment. This suggests someone with access to both victims and considerable knowledge of their habits and medical needs. "There's something else," the inspector continued. "We found evidence that Victoria wore this particular red dress deliberately. According to her diary, also found in the safety deposit box, it was her wedding dress from 1952. She had it altered and wore it to Harold's funeral as a symbolic declaration of her legitimate place as his wife." The poignancy of this revelation was not lost on Miss Marple. Victoria had chosen to make her final public appearance in the dress she had worn to marry the man she loved, transforming it from white to red as a bold statement that their love and marriage deserved recognition. Her appearance at the funeral was not merely dramatic gesture, Miss Marple observed. It was a carefully planned revelation designed to force the truth into the open. She knew that Harold's confession and will were hidden in the safety deposit box, and she wanted to ensure that his death would not allow the truth to remain buried. Inspector Slack gathered the photographs and documents. The question now is whether Victoria knew she was in danger, or whether she simply wanted to honour Harold's memory by ensuring their marriage was acknowledged. "I suspect," Miss Marple said quietly, "that Victoria knew exactly what she was risking. A woman who sews legal documents into her dress and wears her wedding gown to her husband's funeral is not acting on impulse. She was making certain that even if something happened to her, the truth would eventually surface." As Inspector Slack prepared to leave, Miss Marple called him back with one final observation. "Inspector, I think you'll find that the key to solving these murders lies not in the bigamy itself, but in who stood to benefit most from keeping Harold's double life secret. Victoria's red dress has revealed Harold's true intentions, but it has also exposed the motive for preventing those intentions from being realised." The revelation of Harold's confession and will had transformed the case from a simple matter of bigamy into a complex web of murder designed to protect business interests and social standing. Someone had killed to prevent scandal, but in doing so they had created a far greater catastrophe than Harold's unconventional marriages ever could have caused. Chapter 7. Death Comes in Threes. The third death came, as Miss Marple had feared it might, with the same quiet efficiency that had characterised the previous murders. Mr. Blackwood was discovered in his office on Friday morning by his secretary, apparently having suffered a heart attack while working late the previous evening, but Dr. Haydock's immediate examination revealed the telltale bitter almond scent that had marked Victoria's death. "Cyanide again," Inspector Slack reported grimly to Miss Marple, this time administered in a brandy decanter that Blackwood kept in his office for entertaining clients. The killer is becoming bolder, or perhaps more desperate. Miss Marple received this news with the grave expression of someone whose worst fears were being confirmed. Mr. Blackwood had been Harold's business partner for how many years? "Nearly 15 years, the inspector replied. According to the partnership documents, Blackwood handled the day-to-day operations while Harold managed the more, shall we say, creative aspects of their ventures." "By which you mean Harold's frequent absences to maintain his double life?" "Precisely. We've discovered that Blackwood had been covering for Harold's extended trips to Little Wickham, telling clients and associates that Harold was pursuing new business opportunities. In effect, Blackwood was complicit in maintaining Harold's deception." Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting needles clicking with unusual rapidity. A man who had been covering for Harold's absences would necessarily know intimate details about his business arrangements. He would also know which records needed to be destroyed to protect Harold's reputation posthumously. Inspector Slack nodded gravely. "We found evidence in Blackwood's office that he had been systematically destroying business documents that referenced Harold's activities in Little Wickham. Bank statements, travel receipts, correspondence, anything that might support Victoria's claim to legitimacy." "But why continue this effort after Harold's death? Surely Blackwood's business interests would not be affected by the revelation of Harold's bigamy?" "That's where the investigation has uncovered some disturbing facts about their partnership. It appears that Blackwood had been using Harold's frequent absences to manipulate their joint business accounts. He was essentially embezzling from the partnership, confident that Harold's distraction with his double life would prevent discovery." Miss Marple paused in her knitting, her blue eyes sharp with understanding. "And Harold's confession letter mentioned consulting with solicitors about his bigamous situation. Such legal scrutiny would inevitably lead to a thorough examination of his business affairs." "Exactly. Blackwood stood to lose everything if Harold's plan to legitimise both marriages proceeded. The legal complications would require full disclosure of Harold's financial arrangements, which would expose Blackwood's embezzlement. The scope of the crimes was becoming clear. What had begun as an attempt to prevent scandal had evolved into a systematic campaign to eliminate anyone who could expose both Harold's bigamy and Blackwood's financial crimes." "Inspector," Miss Marple said carefully, "if Blackwood was the killer, who murdered him? And why?" Inspector Slack's expression grew troubled. "That's what makes this case so bewildering. Blackwood's death suggests either that he wasn't working alone, or that someone else discovered his crimes and decided to silence him permanently. Before Miss Marple could respond, they were interrupted by the urgent arrival of Constable Lake, who burst into the drawing room with obvious agitation. "Inspector," he gasped. "There's been another development. James Whitmore has disappeared from the safe house where we placed him. His protection detail found evidence of a struggle, and there's blood on the floor." The news struck Miss Marple like a physical blow. The systematic elimination of witnesses was proceeding exactly as she had feared. "How long has he been missing?" Inspector Slack demanded. "We estimate since early this morning. The officers checked on him at midnight, and everything seemed normal. When they returned at 8 o'clock for the shift change, they found the door forced and signs of violence." Miss Marple rose from her chair with sudden determination. "Inspector, I fear we have been thinking about this case incorrectly. We've assumed that the murders were committed to protect someone's interests. But what if they were committed to eliminate evidence of a different crime entirely?" "What do you mean?" "Consider the sequence of deaths. Harold dies just as he's planning to legitimize his marriages and resolve his business affairs. Victoria dies after making her claim public and revealing Harold's confession. Blackwood dies after covering up Harold's activities, but also after embezzling from their partnership. And now James, who could testify to his father's double life, has been kidnapped." Inspector Slack was making rapid notes. "You're suggesting the murders are designed to eliminate all witnesses to Harold's bigamy? More than that, I'm suggesting they're designed to ensure that only one version of the truth survives, a version that benefits the killer financially and socially." Miss Marple moved to her window, gazing out at the village street with its deceptively peaceful appearance. "Inspector, what would happen to Harold's estate if both his marriages were proven invalid?" "Invalid? I'm not sure I follow. What if someone could prove that Harold was never legally married to either woman, that both ceremonies were somehow fraudulent or bigamous from the start?" Inspector Slack considered this possibility. The estate would pass to his next of kin, his son James, or if James were deceased, to more distant relatives. And if James were to die without heirs? The inspector's face paled as he grasped the implications. The estate would be distributed according to the laws of intestacy, potentially reverting to Harold's surviving spouse from his first marriage. Miss Marple turned from the window with a grave expression. "Inspector, I think you need to investigate Harold's first wife's death much more carefully. If Margaret Whitmore was never legally Harold's second wife, she might still be entitled to inherit as his business partner or as someone with a prior claim to his estate. But Margaret has been presenting herself as Harold's legitimate widow. Why would she want to invalidate her own marriage?" "Because," Miss Marple said quietly, "if both of Harold's subsequent marriages can be proven bigamous, Margaret's position as his business associate or first wife's representative might entitle her to everything. She wouldn't need to share with Victoria or worry about James's inheritance." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Someone had been systematically eliminating everyone who knew the truth about Harold's complex marital situation, not to protect his reputation, but to ensure that they alone would benefit from his death. "Inspector," Miss Marple said urgently, "I believe James Whitmore is still alive, but only until the killer can arrange his death to look accidental. We must find him quickly, because he represents the last obstacle to a perfect crime that has been months in the planning." As Inspector Slack rushed from the house to organise a search for James, Miss Marple remained at her window, her mind working through the implications of the third death. The killer had demonstrated remarkable patience and planning, but the acceleration of the murders suggested that some deadline was approaching, perhaps a legal requirement that would expire if not met within a specific time frame. The woman who had worn red to Harold's funeral had unwittingly set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately expose a killer far more cunning and ruthless than anyone had imagined. But that same woman's courage in revealing the truth might also provide the key to saving James Whitmore's life and bringing the murderer to justice. Chapter 8. The Insurance Policy Secret. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. Mr. Pemberton, the family solicitor, arrived at Miss Marple's cottage on Saturday morning in a state of considerable agitation, clutching a leather briefcase as though it contained the crown jewels. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "I've discovered something that changes everything we thought we knew about Harold's death and the subsequent murders." Miss Marple invited him into her drawing room, noting the tremor in his hands as he set down his briefcase. "What have you found, Mr. Pemberton?" "It concerns Harold's life insurance policies. I've been reviewing all the documentation in light of recent events, and I've uncovered a clause that makes the stakes considerably higher than we realized." The solicitor opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder of insurance documents. Harold maintained 3 separate life insurance policies, as Inspector Slack mentioned. But what wasn't immediately apparent is that one of these policies contains a double indemnity clause. Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythmic clicking. Double indemnity? If Harold's death can be proven accidental rather than natural causes, the payout increases from £25,000 to £50,000. But here's the crucial detail. The policy specifically states that benefits are only payable if there is one legitimate surviving spouse. The implication struck Miss Marple immediately. Someone has been killing people, not merely to eliminate witnesses, but to ensure they qualify for the maximum insurance payout. Precisely, and there's more. I've discovered that Harold had been planning to change the beneficiary on this particular policy just before his death. The insurance company has a record of his inquiry about adding Victoria as a co-beneficiary, but the paperwork was never completed. Miss Marple set down her knitting entirely, giving Mr. Pemberton her full attention. Who is currently listed as the sole beneficiary? Margaret Whitmore, and according to the policy terms, if Harold's bigamy were proven, she would still qualify for the full benefit as his legally recognised widow, provided there were no competing claims from a second spouse. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with chilling clarity. Someone had murdered Victoria to eliminate her claim, killed Blackwood to prevent him from revealing Harold's true financial situation, and now had James in order to remove the last witness who could testify to his father's double life. "Mr. Pemberton," Miss Marple said carefully, "have you shared this information with Inspector Slack?" "I came to you first because I wasn't certain of its significance, but now I see that it provides a clear motive for all the murders." Before Miss Marple could respond, the sound of rapid footsteps on her garden path announced another arrival. Inspector Slack burst through the door, his face grim with urgency. "Miss Marple, we found James Whitmore," he announced. "He's alive, but barely. Someone tried to stage his death as a drowning accident in the mill pond, but he managed to escape and crawl to safety." Relief flooded through Miss Marple, followed immediately by concern. "Is he able to speak? Can he identify his attacker?" "He's conscious but weak. Dr. Haydock is with him now, but he's managed to tell us something extraordinary. He says his father's death wasn't natural. Harold confided to him just days before his death that someone had been trying to poison him." Mr. Pemberton looked up from his insurance documents with shock. Harold knew he was being poisoned? According to James, Harold had been feeling increasingly unwell and had begun to suspect that someone was adding something to his food or drink. He was planning to consult Dr. Haydock about testing for toxins when he collapsed. Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing alarm. "Inspector, this suggests that Harold's murderer was someone with regular access to his meals, someone he trusted implicitly. James says his father specifically mentioned being concerned about his business dinners. Apparently, Harold had noticed that he always felt worse after dining with certain associates. The investigation was narrowing to a specific group of suspects, those who had regular contact with Harold and could have administered poison gradually over a period of weeks. There's something else, Inspector Slack continued. James remembers his father mentioning that he had changed his will and hidden important documents where only Victoria would be able to find them. Harold suspected that someone might try to suppress evidence of his bigamy after his death. Mr. Pemberton nodded gravely. That would explain why Harold gave Victoria the key to the safety deposit box and why she sewed it into her dress. He was ensuring that even if something happened to him, the truth about his marriages would eventually surface. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the window, her mind working through the timeline of events. Harold was being slowly poisoned. Victoria was murdered to prevent her claim from being validated. Blackwood was killed to silence him about the business irregularities, and James was nearly killed to eliminate the last witness. All of this to ensure that one person could claim the maximum insurance payout as Harold's sole legitimate widow. But who had access to all these victims? Inspector Slack asked. Who could have poisoned Harold gradually, murdered Victoria in her hotel room, killed Blackwood in his office, and attempted to kill James? Miss Marple turned from the window with a grave expression. Inspector, I think you need to investigate very carefully who had keys to these various locations, who knew about Harold's eating habits and medical conditions, and most importantly, who knew about the double indemnity clause in his insurance policy. The insurance clause wasn't common knowledge, Mr. Pemberton interjected. Harold discussed it with me confidentially, and I believe he may have mentioned it to his immediate family. Inspector Slack was making rapid notes. We need to examine who had access to Harold's food, who could have entered Victoria's hotel room, and who knew about Blackwood's habit of working late in his office. And, Miss Marple added quietly, who knew that James had been placed in protective custody, and where he was being held. The attack on him suggests someone with inside knowledge of police procedures. The scope of the crimes was staggering. A carefully orchestrated campaign of murder designed to eliminate all obstacles to a massive financial windfall. The killer had demonstrated remarkable patience and planning, but the acceleration of the murders suggested that some deadline was approaching. Inspector, Miss Marple said urgently, I believe the killer will attempt to finalise their claim on the insurance policy very soon. The longer this investigation continues, the greater the risk that their scheme will be exposed. We must move quickly to identify and apprehend them before they can complete their plan. As Mr. Pemberton departed with his crucial insurance documents, and Inspector Slack rushed off to continue the investigation, Miss Marple remained in her drawing room, contemplating the cold-blooded calculation that had driven someone to commit multiple murders for financial gain. The woman who had worn red to Harold's funeral had unknowingly triggered a deadly sequence of events, but her courage in revealing the truth might ultimately save James Whitmore's life and expose a killer whose greed had led them to commit increasingly desperate acts of violence. Chapter 9. The Woman Who Never Existed. Sunday morning brought with it a revelation that chilled Miss Marple to the bone. Inspector Slack arrived at Old Pasture with news that transformed their understanding of the entire case. Miss Marple, he said, settling heavily into the chair she offered, we've made a discovery that changes everything. Victoria Whitmore's identity has been systematically erased from all official records. Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. Erased? What do you mean exactly? Someone has been methodically destroying every trace of Victoria's existence. Her marriage certificate has been removed from the church records at St. Michael's in Little Wickham. Her bank accounts have been closed and the records destroyed. Even her rental agreement for the house with the blue door has vanished from the property management files. The implications were staggering. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully as she absorbed this information. Inspector, such systematic destruction requires considerable access to official institutions and records. This is not the work of an amateur. It gets worse. We've discovered that Margaret Whitmore has been working closely with Mr. Pemberton to resolve the complications of Harold's estate. They've been presenting documentation to various institutions proving that Victoria's claims were fraudulent. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest. What sort of documentation? Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. Forged letters, allegedly from Victoria, confessing that her marriage was a sham designed to defraud Harold's estate. Bank statements showing that Harold had been supporting Victoria as a mistress rather than a wife. Even medical records suggesting that Victoria was mentally unstable and prone to delusions. And these documents are convincing. Expertly crafted. If we hadn't found Harold's genuine confession and will in the safety deposit box, We might have believed them ourselves. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to make Victoria appear to be a fabrication. Miss Marple rose and moved to her window, gazing out at the peaceful village scene while her mind worked through the implications. Inspector, this level of forgery and record manipulation requires not only access but expertise. Who would have both the knowledge and the authority to alter official records? That's what troubles me most. Such access suggests someone in a position of trust, a professional who regularly deals with legal documents and institutional records. Before Inspector Slack could elaborate, they were interrupted by the arrival of James Whitmore, who appeared at the garden gate looking pale but determined. Dr. Haydock had apparently released him from medical care, though he still moved with obvious discomfort from his ordeal. "Inspector, Miss Marple," he said as he approached, "I've remembered something important about the night I was attacked. Something that might identify my assailant." Miss Marple invited James inside, noting the haunted expression in his eyes. "What do you remember, my dear?" "The person who attacked me spoke to me before attempting the drowning. They said something very specific, that my father's fantasy life would not be allowed to destroy respectable families. Those exact words. Fantasy life." Inspector Slack leaned forward with interest. "Did you recognize the voice?" It was disguised, muffled by something, but there was something familiar about the phrasing. My attacker spoke like someone educated, someone who uses precise language. James paused, his face troubled. "And they knew details about my father's confession that only someone who had read it could know." Miss Marple felt a familiar stirring of recognition. James, who besides ourselves has had access to Harold's confession letter. Only Mr. Pemberton, as far as I know. He examined all the documents from the safety deposit box to verify their legal validity. A profound silence fell over the room as the implications of this statement became clear. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "I think you need to examine Mr. Pemberton's role in this matter much more carefully. A solicitor would have the knowledge, access, and professional authority to alter official records." Inspector Slack was already reaching for his hat. He would also have known about the insurance policy details and had legitimate reasons to visit all the victims. Solicitors regularly conduct business in hotels, offices, and private homes. "More than that," Miss Marple continued, "Mr. Pemberton would have known that exposing Harold's bigamy would require extensive legal proceedings that could take months or years to resolve. By eliminating Victoria and claiming her marriage was fraudulent, he could ensure that Margaret inherited immediately." James looked bewildered. "But why would Mr. Pemberton care who inherits father's estate? What benefit would it be to him?" Inspector Slack paused at the door, his expression grim. "That's what we need to find out. But I suspect we'll discover that Mr. Pemberton stands to benefit considerably from ensuring that Margaret inherits everything." After the inspector departed to investigate Pemberton's background and activities, Miss Marple found herself alone with James in her drawing room. The young man sat quietly, clearly struggling to process the implications of what they had discovered. "Miss Marple," he said finally, "if Mr. Pemberton has been working with my mother to eliminate evidence of father's bigamy, does that mean mother knew about the murders?" It was the question Miss Marple had been dreading, but she could not spare James from the truth. "I'm afraid that's a possibility we must consider. Your mother would have had to cooperate extensively with Mr. Pemberton to accomplish such systematic destruction of records." James buried his face in his hands. "She's been so devastated by father's death, so shocked by Victoria's claims. I thought her grief was genuine." "Perhaps it was," Miss Marple said gently. "People are capable of experiencing genuine grief while simultaneously protecting their interests. Your mother may have been mourning Harold while also working to ensure that his bigamy didn't destroy her financial security. But murder, Miss Marple? Could mother really be capable of such things?" Miss Marple considered her words carefully. "In my experience, people will go to extraordinary lengths to protect what they perceive as rightfully theirs. If your mother believed that Victoria was trying to steal her inheritance and social position, she might have convinced herself that eliminating this threat was justified. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple reflected on the systematic campaign that had been waged to make Victoria Whitmore disappear from history. It was a plan that required considerable coordination between Margaret and Pemberton, suggesting a partnership that went beyond simple client and solicitor. The woman who had worn red to Harold's funeral had been silenced, but the very boldness of her gesture had set in motion an investigation that would ultimately expose her killers. Victoria's courage in revealing the truth about her marriage had ensured that her murderers would not succeed in erasing her existence entirely. Miss Marple was quite certain that before this matter was resolved, the full extent of Margaret and Pemberton's conspiracy would be revealed, along with the true nature of their relationship and their motives for committing such calculated murders. Chapter 10. Truth Dressed in Crimson. The final confrontation came, as Miss Marple had somehow known it would, at Harold Whitmore's grave. The morning mist hung low over St Mary Mead churchyard as Inspector Slack led Margaret Whitmore and Mr Pemberton to the freshly turned earth where Harold lay buried. Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, her keen eyes noting every detail of the scene that was about to unfold. "Mrs Whitmore," Inspector Slack began formally, "we have evidence that you and Mr Pemberton conspired to murder your husband, Victoria Whitmore, and Mr Blackwood, and attempted to murder your stepson James." Margaret stood beside Harold's grave, dressed in the same black mourning attire she had worn to his funeral, but now the black seemed less a symbol of grief than a costume worn to maintain a deception that was finally crumbling. "Inspector," she replied with admirable composure, "I cannot imagine what has led you to such preposterous conclusions." Mr Pemberton shifted nervously beside her, his usual professional demeanour replaced by obvious anxiety. "This is highly irregular, Inspector. If you have accusations to make, surely they should be made in a proper legal setting." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "I think, Margaret, that you've carried this burden long enough. The truth has a way of demanding to be heard, and Harold's secrets have already cost too many lives." For a moment, Margaret's carefully maintained facade wavered. She looked down at the grave at her feet, where the man she'd shared 30 years of marriage lay buried with his secrets. "You don't understand," she whispered finally. "None of you understand what it was like living with Harold's lies for all those years." Inspector Slack stepped closer. "You knew about Victoria long before Harold's death, didn't you?" Margaret's composure finally shattered. "I discovered his double life 5 years ago," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I found letters in his study, photographs, evidence of an entire life he had built without me. Do you know what it's like to discover that your marriage, your entire existence, has been a lie?" Miss Marple's expression was compassionate but unwavering. "So you decided to eliminate your rival rather than confront your husband?" "I couldn't divorce him," Margaret cried. "I had no independent means, no family to support me. Harold's bigamy would have made me a laughingstock, destroyed my reputation in the village. I would have been left with nothing while that woman claimed half of everything Harold and I had built together." Mr Pemberton placed a warning hand on Margaret's arm, but she shook him off, the words pouring out as though a dam had burst. "I began planning Harold's death months ago," she continued. "Small doses of poison in his food, just enough to weaken his heart gradually. I wanted it to appear natural, peaceful. He deserved that much, despite his betrayal." "But Harold discovered what you were doing," Inspector Slack observed. Margaret nodded miserably. "He confronted me just days before he died, said he knew someone was poisoning him, and that he was going to expose everything. His bigamy, my attempts on his life, all of it. He said he preferred scandal to murder." Miss Marple stepped closer to the grave, noting how the morning light caught the remnants of red roses that had been placed there recently. "That's when you accelerated your plan." "I gave him a massive dose that final night. He collapsed so quickly he couldn't call for help. I thought it was over, that his secrets would die with him. But then that woman appeared at the funeral in that dreadful red dress, making her claims in front of everyone." The symbolism was not lost on Miss Marple. Victoria wore red because it was her wedding dress, transformed from white to crimson as a declaration of her legitimate place as Harold's wife. "She wore red to mock me," Margaret snarled, her grief and rage finally erupting. Standing there in her scarlet dress like some scarlet woman, claiming my husband, my life, my security. I couldn't let her destroy everything I had worked to preserve. Inspector Slack was making careful notes. "So you and Mr. Pemberton devised a plan to eliminate Victoria and destroy all evidence of her marriage to Harold." Mr. Pemberton finally found his voice. "Margaret came to me after the funeral," he said quietly. "She was distraught, terrified that Harold's bigamy would be exposed. I only meant to help her legally, but when she suggested that Victoria might be permanently discouraged from pursuing her claim—" "You provided the poison and the access," Miss Marple finished. "Your professional position gave you credibility with hotel staff, banks, and record offices. You could alter documents and destroy evidence without suspicion." Margaret looked down at Harold's grave with something approaching relief. Victoria was so trusting. She believed the sleeping tablets I gave her would help with her grief. She never suspected that her rival had gained access to her room through the hotel staff. And Mr. Blackwood. He knew too much about Harold's business arrangements. When he began asking questions about the missing will and demanding his share of the partnership profits, we realised he would eventually expose everything. Inspector Slack stepped forward with his handcuffs. "Margaret Whitmore, I arrest you for the murders of Harold Whitmore, Victoria Whitmore, and Thomas Blackwood, and for the attempted murder of James Whitmore." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Margaret looked up at Miss Marple with an expression of exhausted defeat. "You understand, don't you, Miss Marple? I couldn't let that woman in red destroy my life. I couldn't let Harold's deception rob me of everything I had sacrificed for." Miss Marple regarded her with sadness rather than condemnation. "I understand the desperation that drove you to such acts, Margaret. But Victoria wasn't your enemy. She was as much a victim of Harold's deception as you were. She wore red to claim her rightful place, not to destroy yours." As Inspector Slack led Margaret and Pemberton away, Miss Marple remained alone in the churchyard. She walked slowly to Harold's grave and knelt to place fresh red roses beside the headstone. "Truth, like love, cannot be buried forever," she murmured to the morning air. "Victoria wore red to ensure that her marriage would not be forgotten, and in doing so she exposed the darkness that such secrets can breed." In the distance, the church bells of St. Mary Mead began to toll, their sound carrying across the village where life would soon return to its peaceful rhythm. But Miss Marple knew that the woman who had dared to wear red to a funeral had changed everything, forcing the truth into the light even at the cost of her own life. The red dress had been both declaration and sacrifice, ensuring that some secrets were indeed too powerful to remain buried with the dead. Victoria's courage had ultimately brought justice, though she'd not lived to see it triumph over the lies that had cost so many lives. Miss Marple rose from beside the grave, her duty to the dead finally complete. The woman in red had found her voice at last, and her truth would be remembered long after the black lies that had tried to silence her were forgotten.